Yeah. Even if you're not a fan of horror movies, most people are at least familiar with movies like these, like Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Everybody knows they're about serial killers, you know. With the exception of Silence of the Lambs could be considered a thriller. They still all kind of fall into the same category. The question is, aside from that, what do they have in common? They were all inspired by Ed Gein, also known as Eddie Gein to the local people. In 1906, Ed Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His parents were George and Augusta Gein. He had an older brother, 4 years older than him, named Henry. His father was an alcoholic, and actually, he was pretty passive. He was completely submissive to Augusta. His mother, Augusta, was a religious extremist, and she was extremely verbally abusive and domineering. In 1914, she had decided that the city of La Crosse was too sinful, so she picked up her family and she moved them to this farmhouse just outside of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Though his mother was extremely overbearing and controlled everything everybody in the house did, Eddie referred to her as being pure goodness. He looked up to her. She was the greatest person on earth to him. But her overbearing caused him to be extremely socially awkward as a child. He had a difficult time making friends. If he did make friends, he would come home and tell his mother about him, and then she would tell him how awful their families were, how sinful they were, and how he needed to stay away from them. In high school, he started to be interested in girls, but she would force on the boys. Girls are horrible, they're harlots, they're nothing but evil, stay away from girls, no women. She didn't want them to get married, have children, nothing. She wanted them to be her idea of pure holiness. As an adult, Eddie worked as a handyman. He did odd jobs around town, things like that. He was generally considered a little odd, but friendly enough. Nobody thought much of him. In April of 1940, his father, George, died of a heart attack. His mother was, needless to say, happy. She never thought very much of his father. In May of 1944, his brother Henry died in a somewhat suspicious fire. Henry and George were out trying to control a brush fire near their farm. And George had said, Eddie had said that he lost sight of Henry during the fire. And when he went to get help, he was able to bring the help back to exactly where Henry's body was. And Henry's body appeared to have been placed in the middle of the burned area, though the body wasn't burned at all. Nobody thought Eddie was at all capable of killing somebody, let alone his older, stronger brother. So it was kind of brushed off, and eventually the coroner said that he died of smoke inhalation, basically. Then, in December of 1945, just about a year and a half later, and things were going great. He thinks, great, I've got my mother all to myself. But here, a year and a half later, he loses his mother to a stroke. For the first time in his life, Eddie was completely alone and didn't know what to do. He was extremely lonely, and he had to find ways to keep himself busy. He read a lot of books. He loved to read books. He loved to read adventure books. He loved to read anatomy books. He would read crime novels. He read crime magazines. He was just really, really fascinated with these things, but he would read anything. After a while, he started to hang around in the cemeteries. Once again, it was just kind of Eddie. Everybody thought he was a little odd. Nobody thought much of it. And all his reading, he would read the newspapers, front to back every day, and he started to become obsessed with the obituaries. After a while, he would follow the obituaries, and when a woman was buried in the cemetery, he would go sometimes as soon as that day to dig her body up and take it home with him. After his mother died in 1945, there was an increase in missing persons in the area of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Once again, nobody would have ever thought to associate it with Eddie Gein. The only thing that really strange that happened was the closest thing he ever had to a friend was a 15-year-old boy. At this time, Eddie was well into his 40s, was a 15-year-old boy who had come over to his house. They had just gone hunting, and Eddie asked him if he wanted to see his prized collection. And he pulls out a collection of, as graphic as it is, human heads. And the boy says, "What's this?" And Eddie basically explains it as, "I have a friend that was in the military in the Philippines, and he sent these back to me. They're authentic shrunken heads." And, you know, the kid tells people about it, and it starts rumors, but everybody just thinks, well, it's just weird old Eddie again. And, you know, he kind of got the name by that point, that he was just weird old Eddie. It was just a little off. Until December 8th, 1954. Mary Hogan ran a local tavern in town. She disappeared on December 8th, 1954. The only thing that was left of her was a pool of blood on the floor and a gun casing from a .32 caliber gun. Nobody, once again, thought Eddie could have done anything like that, so nobody looked to him. One of the people he worked for at the time, you know, because he was a handyman, he did odd jobs around the town. One of the people he worked for had said to him, "If you'd spent more time courting Mary, then maybe she'd be at your house cooking for you rather than being missing somewhere." And Eddie replies to him, "She's not missing, she's down at the house right now." Well, this guy didn't think anything of it. Once again, it's just weird old Eddie. You know, all these strange things are piling up around him, but nobody's noticing yet. November 16th, 1957. Bernice Warden disappears. Nobody knows until the next morning she's disappeared. Eddie Gein walks into her, she's just a shop owner. Eddie Gein walks into her shop in the morning and says, "I need some antifreeze." And so he buys the antifreeze, and he comes back 15 minutes later and says that he wants to sell her one of his guns. Nobody ever sees Bernice Warden again. The next morning, her son, who was on a hunting trip over the weekend, comes in, and he can't find his mother. He notices blood on the floor, and a receipt made out to Eddie Gein for the antifreeze. And immediately he says, he's done something with her. And everybody's like, "Who? What are you talking about?" He says, Eddie's done something with her. And everybody goes, why are you going to Ed Gein? He says, "Because he's been hanging around here an awful lot lately. All of a sudden, he's taken a really big interest in my mother. I don't understand it. Now he was the last person that anybody can confirm has seen her alive. I think he's done something with her." So the police eventually arrest Ed Gein. It takes about 2 hours before they catch up with him, but he's just at a friend's house having coffee. So they arrest Ed Gein, and they go to his house, obviously looking for Bernice Warden's body. What they find is a disgusting, filthy home of a hoarder. It's trash everywhere. He had coffee cans full of used gum. He was a disgusting hoarder. But the most disturbing things were what you might call his artwork. They found collections of masks made from human faces, suits, vests, belts, everything made from human skin. They found lampshades made from human skin, furniture made out of human bones and skin. One of the most famous things they found, aside from the things that he wore, was a soup bowl made out of a human skull. He thought it was normal. Eventually, throughout interrogation, he did confess to killing Bernice Warden, and then after a couple more days, he confessed to killing Mary Hogan, but swore he never killed anybody else, regardless of all the other missing persons cases. He said he never killed anybody else. They couldn't find any evidence to connect him to any of those other crimes, but he did confess to killing Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan. He didn't show any remorse for it. In fact, he didn't seem to understand that what he had done was so horribly wrong as we might think it is. So, when it came time for the trial, it was decided he was unfit to stand trial. He was deemed unfit. Shortly thereafter, on March 20th, 1958, a fire burned almost his entire house down. There wasn't anything left. There were a few things left. There wasn't much left. It was a suspected case of arson, but they had no suspects. Nobody was ever tried for it. It was just kind of left as it was. In November of 1968, they decided he was able to stand trial. They decided after 10 years in a mental hospital, he was able to stand trial. So he went to trial. There were 7 witnesses. Everybody testified against him. But in the end, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He thereby spent the rest of his life in Wisconsin's Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he died in 1984 of cancer. So now, back to the movies we started with. The question, once again, was what do these movies all have in common? Ed Gein inspired all of these movies. Psycho, a man obsessed with his mother. Even after her death, he was obsessed with his mother. He wore his mother's clothes, much the way Ed Gein wore women's skin. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre, obviously wearing people's skin. A little creepy. And then Silence of the Lambs, once again, wearing people's skin. A little effeminate, questionable sexuality. You know, they were all inspired by, and all the writers have confessed to them all having been inspired by Ed Gein. The difference is, all these movies were about serial killers. Ed Gein technically was not a serial killer. He was only ever tried and convicted for killing 2 people, and it takes 3 to be considered a serial killer. Though he's considered one of the most brutal people in American history, he was not a serial killer. But this horrific event has inspired many, many, many movies, not just these. And I guess we have something to thank him for, but I don't think that it was worth his horrific crimes against humanity. So are there any questions?
Who were the other heads that he found in that he was showing the little boy?
Most of them were from graves that he robbed.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
He knew most of the graves that he robbed, but they never actually identified each body piece, partly because they had problems legally exhuming the graves. You know, did the family members want to go through that, and the cost and everything. They had problems exhuming the bodies to see if his story corroborated. But yeah, he claimed it to be bodies he exhumed from graves. Anything else? Well, thank you.